Welcome back. I hope you've thoroughly enjoyed or will enjoy the play Lysistrata 411 BC about the sex strike. This is the effort put together by women of several different polis to oppose the participation in this major bloody war, the Peloponnesian War, by all of their husbands in the different polis. They team up despite the various quarrels that are represented with Athenians and Spartans and Corinthians and Thebans and Megarians and so forth, and they're able to put aside their differences to be able to retain sexual favor from their husbands, and eventually the husbands harden up and are unable to resist the wiles and temptations of the women, and finally agree to end the peace, end the war, and bring about peace. We can't really be sure from this play whether Aristophanes was really trying to get the war to end. I suspect that Aristophanes would have been realistically grounded enough to know that in real life the Athenians really didn't have a way to end the war properly, and for them to do so right at that very moment, especially in the middle of the coup that we'll talk about in a bit, was probably not realistic. And it's not necessarily would not necessarily even have been in the Athenians' best interest to just simply end the war outright. Probably Aristophanes instead was trying to show that there might be alternative solutions for dealing with a desperate matter. So he gives this hypothetical example that, of course, a male Athenian audience would have thought absurd because women could in fact never serve in government in real Athens. But he provides this hypothetical example of what would happen if the women should happen to take over the government and force the Athenian men to surrender their position in the war and allow peace to take over for the sake of reunion with their wives. Could it happen? Well, here's an example of how potentially it could happen. But it does appear to be simply a gesture on Aristophanes' part. It's not really clear necessarily that he would really have expected any of this to work properly. So before talking about the play, let's talk once again about the major event that this reflects, and this is a pretty graphic one. This is the coup in 411 BC of the oligarchy that temporarily suspended the Athenian democracy. We have two prominent politicians, not referred to in this play, but both referred to prominently in our final of the 5 plays, Frogs, next video. We have Alcibiades and we have Theramenes. We'll talk about both of them in a minute. So recall that in the birds video, that the Athenians had sent the massive expedition out to Sicily to try to take over the whole island. A year after the production of birds, the Athenians learned gradually and then finally convincingly that the entire expedition sent out to Sicily had been wiped out completely, except for a few stray escapees and fugitives, especially those who were able to recite Euripides' poetry while they were stuck in their prisons down in these pits underground, as described to us by the historian Thucydides. So the Athenians unwisely chose to send off this expedition, even though their great statesman Pericles had warned them not to expand militarily this way. They did it, and they paid an enormous price. Actually, the price that they paid is hidden here. It's not just simply that they lost so many men in Sicily and that morale dropped so low. Obviously, those things do matter, and they were huge losses. But the real problem with the Athenians here is they get distracted by this war effort, not to mention that they also get worn down because of all the losses. And it gives the Spartans new grist for the mill in the war effort, particularly because as a consequence of the failure of that 4-city coalition in 418 BC to defeat the Spartans at Mantinea, the city of Argos kept on pressing the Athenians over and over again to try to get these Spartans back into the main war, principally because if the Spartans had more allies of the Athenians to fight against, this would of course have been the presumption from the first phase of the war, with not much success there either, that the Spartans would be much more likely to get worn down in that war effort. So the Argives kept on talking the Athenians into making attacks on Spartan territory, and finally in 414 BC, when the Athenians thought everything was going their way, they did it. And as a result, they reinitiated the war only to discover a year later that that was a tragic mistake because the Athenians actually had suffered this terrible tragedy out in Sicily. So when we come to 411 BC, the Athenians are now questioning whether their democracy is really all that great. They're investigating what should be done with the democracy to ensure that such a terrible policy decision never again comes before them and stirs the populace into making such a terrible mistake. So they had set aside a group of people to act as counselors, those who would oversee the legislation coming in. Well, that innocent-seeming decision would have very grave consequences. We'll discuss those in a little bit, and then we'll go back and talk about what's going on with Lysistrata to show how humorously Aristophanes treats this particular subject matter. So we have to go back to Alcibiades. He is the general, recall, who was supposed to serve on the Sicilian campaign, but he got recalled from his post because of a crime that he allegedly had committed back at Athens the night before the campaign was supposed to go out, which was the desecration of all the Herm statues in front of each of the Athenian houses, a crime that probably he did not actually commit. But he was accused, and he eventually was convicted to death, as it turns out, unconstitutionally, while he was away. So he was recalled by the state trireme, and he was supposed to go back to be executed, but instead ran off to the Spartans and informed them about the Sicilian expedition. That put the Alcibiades now in the Spartan camp. And now that he was supposedly a trusted assistant to the Spartans wanted him to continue to make efforts to get more support for their cause. And Alcibiades kept on going up and down trying to get Spartan support in different Athenian territories, including notably in the territory of Chios, that would ended up actually revolting from the Athenian League a year prior to the oligarchic coup. And most notably, Alcibiades connected with the Persians, who suddenly showed up on the scene, especially a certain fellow, rather notorious in Greek history later, by the name of, I'll put his name over here, it's a little bit off here, but I'll turn that for you. Tissaphernes. Tissaphernes was a Persian leader called a satrap, S-A-T-R-A-P, a Persian governor of territory. Tissaphernes, as it turns out, was quite the opportunist and scumbag, basically. He heard what Alcibiades was trying to accomplish as he was going around in the Eastern Aegean trying to work up pro-Spartan, anti-Athenian propaganda. And he connected with Alcibiades and promised that if he could get a place to revolt away from Athens, that he would provide Spartan support. He would finance it, and the rebellion would become the place where they would work together in order to spread further pro-Spartan propaganda. In fact, he was probably lying about all of that. But that was the offer that he made to Alcibiades. So that was actually one of the incentives for the revolt at Chios in 412 BC. And around that same time, there were also some other revolts, including one at Miletus as well, both of which were eventually suppressed by the Athenians before the big coup. But the one at Chios did cause the Athenians quite a bit of consternation because that was one of the three charter members of the Delian League supplying ships. And Samos had already revolted, Lesbos had already revolted, so now Chios did it. Now, one of the assistants to Alcibiades was this fellow Theramenes, who apparently was also, for different purposes, involved in that revolution. He himself was a revolutionary politician at Athens and was interested in oligarchy. However, he was able to back out of the revolt in time in order not to get implicated in it once the Athenians were able to suppress that revolt. So there's a reference to that in Frogs that we'll refer to when we turn over to Frogs. All right, so Alcibiades tried to carry out this plan of setting up this rebellion, and it didn't work. And Tissaphernes kept on offering further promises of further Persian support, but they didn't seem to pan out, and eventually the Spartans got tired of waiting. And so it appeared that Alcibiades lost the favor that he had with the Spartans, and now needed to try to get back into the Athenians' interests. And so in 411 BC, he did so by locating revolutionaries at Samos. And so once again, Samos comes to the fore, just as it did back in 440 BC when it revolted from the Delian League. Alcibiades tries to set up a mechanism by which the Samians could send representatives to tell the Athenians falsely that if the Athenians would temporarily suspend their democracy, more for appearance's sake, that the Persians would supply aid to the Athenian side. And again, this was partly because of what Alcibiades heard from Tissaphernes. And so the Samians sent the representatives over there. Well, in fact, what happened was that Alcibiades and those revolutionaries contacted revolutionaries in Athens itself. And when they all came in together into the city, there was an assassination carried out and a coup. And now that group of counselors I mentioned before that was supposed to oversee the democracy, now all of a sudden became the actual oligarchy that now took over Athens. Because there were 400 of them in the group, they came to be known as the 400. So now we have the coup itself, 411 BC. We have now the suspension of democracy in Athens, and we now have an oligarchy. What caused this group of 400 to fail, however, was two things. First of all, they did not actually know how to continue the war properly. And in fact, there was a rebellion on the island of Euboea, north of Athens. That was one of the triggering points for the Athenian populace to assert themselves and finally depose the 400. And the second problem was that the 400 promised, as part of the deal for their getting into power, that they would enfranchise a group of 5,000 Athenian citizens. And they never did that. Well, after the revolt of Euboea, the Athenians deposed the 400, but first forced them to actually set up the register of 5,000. Once the 400 were out of power, the 5,000 took over. The 5,000 actually ran the city quite well for about 8 months, according to the historian Thucydides. And they scored a couple of military successes that would in fact contribute to a period where the Athenians got themselves back into the high point in the war again. Thucydides makes a wry comment along the way that if the Athenians could possibly have selected the enemy that they would get to fight against in the Peloponnesian War, they could never have done better than the Spartans. They were the most convenient enemy for the Athenians ever to have to fight, because the Spartans had this opportunity to capitalize on the loss in Sicily and didn't take advantage of it. And so the Athenians were able to build themselves back up again and almost looked like they were going to be as strong as ever. All right, so the following year, 410 BC, the 5,000 still running the city scored several additional major successes for the Athenians. Both Alcibiades and Theramenes were involved now on the Athenian side, and after an especially great victory, 410 BC at Cyzicus, the Spartans actually approached the Athenians for peace. Now we have a new fellow, another rough by the name of Cleophon, second rough, who now steps up and tells the Athenians, don't accept peace. And the Athenians, unfortunately, listen to him, and they reject the peace offer that they might, a few years later, have decided was actually the better thing for them to have. In any event, because of that, the 5,000 are able to stay in power, and they rule for another year until 409 BC, and then they finally officially abdicate and turn the city back over to the Athenian populace, and democracy is finally fully restored in Athens. So the oligarchy turned out to be short-lived, but it was a very scary period for the Athenians. It was almost like a reign of terror when the coup was actually in place. So not surprisingly, Aristophanes, as the comic playwright, is not in a position to make very public comments about the horrible way that the city is being run or anything like that. So, I mean, this is not Cleon now. Cleon and Aristophanes might have had some comic backs and forth, but when you're talking about a real regime, things are quite different. You don't open your mouth. So Aristophanes chose the relatively safe concept of the revolution of the women, probably because this not only was this humorous to show women who could overtake men, something that the Athenians appear to have appreciated, but also because it would not arouse any political temper in the sense of looking revolutionary or looking like Aristophanes was trying to end the war or get them out of power or anything like that. So what happens in the play is that Lysistrata teams up, as we said, with a group of women from other cities to withhold sex. They take an oath very reluctantly that they will do this. And then the women end up spreading this battle of the sexes all through the cities. And the elder women of the population of Athens take over the Acropolis where all the money is stored. So this is a dual chorus, which is kind of unusual in any Greek play. You have the women chorus, the elderly women, and you have the elderly men who come in trying to battle the elderly women initially until they actually end up reconciling later and become one chorus. So the women take over the Acropolis to keep the money stored away, and the men come in and try to oust the women and, of course, are unsuccessful. So it's very hard for Lysistrata to keep all these women up on the Acropolis, where they're up there for safekeeping, because the women start getting very uneasy about not having sex, and they try to make up excuses to leave. Eventually, a man shows up, Canisius, the husband of one of Lysistrata's conspirators, Myrine. There's a go-between where the two of them look like they're about to have sex right there on the grass and right outside the wall of the Acropolis. However, Myrine is really tricking her husband to agree to the peace terms. And eventually, when Canisius sort of says something rather snotty, like, well, I'll think about it, Myrine finally just runs up and leaves him there, probably naked on this couch, to slam the door in his face and say, well, no deal. And it's a really funny scene that you saw there, or will see in the middle of the play, where Canisius is waiting to have sex with Myrine, having promised that he would make sure the peace went through, and she's going to have sex with him, but she keeps bringing out various things like the blanket and the pillow and the mattress and some perfume and so forth. And then finally, when Canisius, who's probably very impatient by that point, doesn't sound like he's going to go with his word, then she just runs back and just rejects him. So in the end, the Athenian and the Spartan representatives, all of whom are hard up, agree to peace. They manage to reconcile. Lysistrata gives them a real dressing down for all of their past mistakes. There's a beautiful naked woman. All the geography that's referred to in the process of deciding what land and what territory should go to which side turns out to sound very similar to anatomical parts of the body. It's one of the most brilliant sets of puns that Aristophanes ever comes up in a play. And eventually the two sides are able to reconcile. And what Lysistrata really does point out to both sides is that, in fact, the two sides really should have been much better off working together like a dual hegemony between the two sides, rather than disputing with each other. And that, in fact, the disputes came about from a lot of prior causes, real and imagined on both sides, that really caused both sides to carry out actions that neither side, in fact, should have been. So there's really quite a bit of Athenian politics that we could see in this play. And one of the most brilliant scenes, besides the reconciliation one with the woman, is also the one about the wool. There's a point when the women first take over the city, an Athenian magistrate comes, pretty hapless as it turns out, and the women really give him the business too. Lysistrata describes in very close detail the way that the Athenian populace needs to be, and the government needs to be changed around. She talks about the whole process of carding wool, basically trying to comb out all of the defective elements of the wool, like for birds and so forth. So these are also all the defective elements of the society that have to be gradually worked out, and the society has to be cleansed in order to finally make the government work properly. I have a suspicion that rhetoric of that nature is probably what infiltrated a lot of the rhetoric that brought about the coup. If you think about the Star Wars scene, the discussion between Anakin and Padme about the way that disagreeing parties should in fact be brought together by a wise person who is supposed to oversee everything and bring about agreement, and how Padme rejects that idea by saying it sounds like a dictatorship. In effect, what Lysistrata talks about in this wool carding is kind of like that in the sense that if the city is going to go through this cleansing process, basically the city has to latch on to the citizen body under its control in order to be able to enforce a particular way of bringing the city even to some state of improvement. So it's very, so in a way, when Lysistrate is talking that way, what she's saying is a little bit revolutionary in its way, and again could reflect the kind of revolutionary rhetoric that might have driven oligarchically minded Athenian citizens to act to take down the Athenian democracy. Okay, so as I say, this is really a fantastically brilliant play. It is definitely one of the most sexually explicit plays that we have of Aristophanes, but it does so in a really remarkable way of combining the politics of the occasion with human nature. It turns out that the withholding of sex is exactly what the men need to finally be persuaded, coerced maybe, into deciding that peace really is better than war, and that they really would do well if they want their physical condition to be alleviated, to finally, again, learn to put aside their differences. And the reconciliation scene at the very end with all the men and women getting together and the dance scene is really quite uplifting and quite thrilling to see. If only real life had been that redemptive. We turn finally in our last of these videos to frogs. Really, I would say the funniest and most brilliant of Aristophanes' plays, and in its own way also the saddest and most tragic. We'll turn to that video in our next video. See you then.